Namaste friends. In this video, we are going to discuss on fundamental rights, directive principles and policies provisions in Constitution of Nepal. Let's discuss on fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are basic human rights provisioned by the Constitution so as to ensure that they will not be violated by the government using discretionary power. So, fundamental rights are also human rights, but they are provisioned in Constitution. Fundamental rights are rights of citizen against state. Fundamental rights shall be restored by constitutional remedy in case of violation. If government violates the citizens' fundamental right, Supreme Court will restore them through its extraordinary jurisdiction. In our Constitution, Part 3 from Article 16 to 46, there are provision of 31 fundamental rights. And in exam point of view, if the question is related with fundamental rights and we cannot write all 31 fundamental rights because of time restriction. Time management is so much important in exam. So if we are going to write 31 fundamental rights, then we can't write other things. So while attempting the question related to fundamental rights, just divide them in three categories. First generation human rights. Those are right to live with dignity, right to freedom. Second generation human rights. Right to housing, right to food, right to health. And third generation human rights like right to clean environment, right to social justice. These all first generation, second generation and third generation human rights are included in our constitution as fundamental rights. We can explain in this way. The shortcoming we can write critically, lack of adequate resources to fulfill the economic rights. Fundamental rights are limited with legal provisions. This could be our critical approach because second generation human rights and third generation human rights like right to housing, right to food, right to health, right to clean environment, this type of fundamental right needs fund to fulfill these rights. So without adequate economic resources, we cannot fulfill those fundamental rights. Next is, in most of fundamental rights, there is the provision of making law. So it seems that fundamental rights are not exclusive rights, but they are under the mercy of legislature. That was our critical approach. Let's discuss directive principles of state. Directive principles are the long-term concept and destination pursued by state. Part 4 of our constitution, in Article 50, there are 4 directive principles. In political, it says protecting the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of the country, strengthening federal democratic republican system. That was the political principle. Building civilized and egalitarian society in all form of discrimination. These are the socio-cultural principles. Developing socialism-oriented economy, exploitation-free and sustainable development. These are the economic principles. And protecting national interest and promoting national prestige based on sovereign equality. This is the directive principle related international relation of our country. Let's discuss on policy of state. Policy is the activity to be carried out to achieve the goal set by directive principle. In Part 4, Article 51, there are 13 sectoral policies. As we say earlier, directive principle and policies are the long-term goal. That's why Constitution itself said we cannot question this issue in court, but court still can issue directive orders on the policy matter. There is provision of submission report which would be discussed on parliament and monitoring by parliament committee, and there is 3 approach to see the gravity of directive principle and policy. There are one scholars, they said directive principle and policy have no value because it cannot have constitutional remedy. We cannot raise the question on court. And some constitutional scholars said these have moral value. We cannot raise in court. But if politicians don't follow the directive principle, politicians will punished by people from periodic election. And some constitutional lawyer said even fundamental principle and policy also have binding value. court can indicate if government do otherwise. What are the similarity between fundamental rights and directive principle? Both are issue of human rights. Number one, both are provision of constitution. Both are directed to contribute dignified human lives. Both fundamental rights and directive principle is responsibility of state towards citizen. They are essential component of democracy, and both fundamental rights and directive principles are directed toward people's welfare. And here is differences between fundamental right and directive principle. Fundamental right is obligation of state to fulfill immediately, but in directive principle case, state will fulfill gradually as per availability of resources. Fundamental rights have constitutional remedy in case of violation, but we cannot raise the question in court for directive principle. Fundamental right, that's why have binding value. Directive principle only have moral value. Court provide remedy for non-compliance of fundamental right. People will punish in periodic election for non-compliance with directive principle. Fundamental rights are directed against state power. Directive principles are guiding philosophy of government. Fundamental rights reflect the present situation of country. Directive principle reflects the aspiration of the country. Fundamental rights are mixed of positive and negative rights. Directive principles are aggregate of positive rights. These are the differences between fundamental rights and directive principle. Here is one landmark case related to directive principle. As we discussed earlier, in Constitution, there is provision of fundamental right cannot be questioned in court. But in Yogi Nararinath's case, court said, though court cannot provide a remedy in the matter of directive principles and policy of the state provided in the Constitution, court still can point out the government's decision contrary to the directive principle and policy. In this principle, court said issue related with directive principle normally cannot raise in the court, but government have to go in the direction of fulfilling the directive principle. It should not go opposite direction of directive principle. If government do so, Supreme Court still have the right to point it out. Here is conclusion. Fundamental rights and directive principles of state both are matter of human rights that the state promised to provide to its citizens. Fundamental rights are rights related to immediate action, but directive principles are also sooner or later state needs to implement. Adhering to democratic value and norms while using scarce resources judiciously is warranted for the realization of citizens' both negative and positive rights enshrined in the Constitution. Here comes end of our discussion. Feel free to comment and put your observation. If you haven't subscribed my channel, please subscribe it. Thank you very much.